Hello, this is Mark Millar, author of the book Global Supply Chain Ecosystems. I am pleased to be able to share with you my thoughts and insights about the COVID-19 impact on global supply chains. We are now on the cusp of a thrilling new era for supply chain. This coronavirus crisis has vividly exposed the profound interdependencies in today's global supply chain ecosystems and powerfully demonstrated the intrinsic risks in our complex, connected, volatile world. In this presentation, I will explore the supply chain ramifications of COVID-19, which is already proving to be a super accelerator of some pre-existing megatrends, including globalization shifts, digital disruption, and the e-commerce frenzy. The next normal will be characterized by uncertainty. But what is certain is that this virus will have significant supply chain implications, both over the short-term 12 to 18 months, but also over the subsequent 2 to 3 year medium term, such that supply chain 2025 will be substantially different on multiple dimensions. The initial impact of COVID-19 was supply-side gridlock, as mainland China went into a coronavirus-induced hibernation just after the extended Chinese New Year holidays. This resulted in global shortages of components and products, making it powerfully and painfully apparent just how global supply chains have become inextricably dependent upon China. COVID then embarked on its own globalization journey, spreading fear and uncertainty around the world as healthcare systems became overwhelmed. Widespread lockdowns ensued, with shops and businesses closing. High street retail came to an abrupt halt, triggering the most dramatic collapse in demand. The exceptions, of course, being medical supplies and equipment, which experienced an unprecedented surge in demand. As consumers became unable or unwilling to venture out of their homes, shopping for groceries and household essentials moved online en masse, turbocharging the e-commerce frenzy and generating unparalleled volume growth in small packages for home deliveries. Then, just as China started to reopen their economy and factories were getting back to work, production orders were getting cancelled due to excess inventories and lack of demand. And so global supply chains ground to a halt. As these extraordinary supply chain shocks reverberated around the world, companies are being forced to urgently reevaluate their sourcing strategies, business models, and distribution channels. This inevitably resurfaced discussions about the relocation of offshored production. Let's recap. Nearshoring is the relocation of production activities closer to the market where the products are going to be consumed. Onshoring, also known as reshoring, is one step further, whereby production is moved back into the country where the goods are going to be consumed. These are not new topics. Recall other huge supply chain shocks such as the Fukushima earthquake, the Iceland volcano, and the Thailand floods. They all triggered animated nearshoring discussions, championing the need to relocate production closer to the final consumption markets. However, what typically happens is that enthusiasm for change tends to dissipate as things soon get back to normal, and companies realize the actual enormity of truly reconfiguring their supply chains. But this time is different. This time, I believe, nearshoring will become more than just talk for a number of reasons. Firstly, this COVID crisis is much more severe in impact and global in reach than previous supply chain shocks. the consequences from a supply chain perspective will be much deeper, much wider, much more long-lasting. Secondly, this COVID predicament is intertwined with massive geopolitical tensions between the world's superpowers. Tensions which have already triggered some companies to relocate the production of their US-destined products in order to avoid the US tariffs on China-sourced imports. And thirdly, with the continuing growth in emerging markets and the increase in intra-regional trade, globalization had already become somewhat stalled. And so with the increasing polarization between East and West, coupled with lingering frustrations about differences in business practices, I believe it's inevitable there will be some decoupling, resulting in changes to global trade flows. And so COVID becomes the catalyst that actually stimulates companies into taking real action on reshoring and nearshoring initiatives, which will reduce dependencies and diversify risks, but will obviously result in shorter supply chains. However, relocating your supply chain is much easier said than done. This is not for the faint-hearted. Today's supply chains have been built up and fine-tuned and developed over a number of years, if not decades. They cannot just be readily untangled, packed up and moved elsewhere. This is a serious undertaking, whether nearshoring or reshoring. It's a project that's likely to be measured in years, not weeks or months. And whilst COVID is a catalyst for companies to take action, COVID-related restrictions will inhibit the process of reconfiguring the supply chain by nature of travel-related limitations and, of course, the restriction on in-person exchanges. Accelerating the process, on the other hand, will be government incentives. The United States, with much fanfare, has announced grants and subsidies and tax relief for American companies that relocate their manufacturing back into the United States of America and create American jobs. It's not just America. Canada, Korea, some European countries have all announced initiatives to encourage the relocation of manufacturing. Japan, for example, has allocated a $2.2 billion fund to help Japanese companies repatriate their manufacturing back into Japan and create local jobs. Now, of course, in these first world economies, there's a concern about the high cost of labor. And this is where I believe we'll see automation come readily into play. Robotics and automation are substantially lower cost now than they were 20 or 30 years ago when we started the offshoring globalization journey. And readily available, economically viable automation solutions will ease the process of reshoring manufacturing back into developed market economies. Now, for nearshoring, the key beneficiaries need to obviously be in close proximity to the final consumption market and have lower cost platforms. So the key contenders for the United States market, for example, would be Mexico as the leading contender, leveraging the North American Free Trade Agreement as well. For European markets, Eastern European countries such as Poland, Turkey, Hungary would be leading contenders as nearshoring platforms. So nearshoring will reduce reliance on Asia in general and China specifically, and we'll see the supply chains being typically much more regionally focused and therefore shorter. They could be configured as made in Latin America for America or made in Eastern Europe for Europe. However, this will in no way result in a mass exodus of manufacturing outside of China, but we will see some diversification across the Asia region. Several reasons for this. First of all, we are now firmly in the Asian century. 1/3 of global GDP is in Asia. We are home to 1.8 billion people in the consuming class. And by the year 2030, Asia will represent 2/3 of the world's middle class. So made in Asia for Asia will remain a very viable supply chain strategy for generations to come. And this will enable companies to capitalize on the huge potential across Asia's emerging economies. At the same time, more and more companies will also be diligently exploring their China Plus options, looking for additional locations around Asia for sourcing and production of products and components where there is abundant labor that is lower cost than the China labor has become. Different sectors will have a different mobility, if you like. Garments, footwear, sports goods, furniture, their supply chains are relatively mobile or movable, certainly compared to much more complex products and supply chains like high-tech electronics, household goods, and automobiles. So the leading contenders around the Asia region, they vary by industry segment. But Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, these are all contenders for post-pandemic divergence of production activities that can leverage their low-cost labor markets. However, none of these alternatives can match the huge extent of China's resources. China remains the clear leader in both scale and scope, leveraging its massive infrastructure investments over the last 20 years and its huge workforce. And for that very reason, many supply chains will remain in China, or at least remain China-centric. And that includes all the multinational companies who are selling into China's enormous domestic market, whether they are targeting the consumer or the industrial segments. Such companies will retain within China all their manufacturing, sourcing, and assembly activities for goods destined for sale in the domestic China market in the supply chain strategy that is now known as in China for China. So in summary, the consequences of COVID-19 will result in a step change for global trade as we know it, spelling the end of 30 years of globalization. Post-pandemic, the next normal will see some radical reconfiguration of global supply chains, adopting a much more regional and localized approach. Evolving through to year 2025, we can expect to see widespread deployment of shorter supply chains that increase control, increase responsiveness, and increase resilience, whilst also reducing lead times, reducing transport costs, and reducing emissions, and helping to mitigate risk. And so in times of such great uncertainty, it is best to be prepared. Companies should be planning for the worst, hoping for the best, and always expect the unexpected.